Wanted to make this video about historical significance because one of the things that we most often miss when we're doing the timeline assignments in particular is that issue of historical significance. One of the ways that we started this semester in this class was by thinking about history as a discipline, the nature of history, how we study history, the kinds of questions we'd like to ask or should ask. And so I think that it's important to kind of connect those two concepts, the notion of significance with how we do history. To not belabor the point and go into a lengthy discussion of historiography, history itself, one of the definitions of it at least, is the study of change over time, also the study of continuities over time, trying to figure out what has changed and why, what stayed the same and why. The field of history itself has changed over time as well. Some of these images that I have up here, such as this book, That Noble Dream by Peter Novick, it provides a pretty good history of history. That might sound horribly boring, but it's actually not. It's talking about the historical profession coming together in the 19th century as an academic field with a professional association. And back then, the idea of historians thinking that there is something called objectivity in history and that we can come to know the absolute historical truth. Historians also felt that their role was to support their nations. So to tell very, what's the right word? Very pleasing histories about the nation in order to build patriotism and citizenship. And those ideals are good ideals still. But as we saw in the late 19th century and even the early 20th century, sometimes that was taken to the point that histories were whitewashed and sanitized, controversies not really dealt with. So that was an issue that the field of history itself had. Since that time, we've become much more critical of how we do history, the limitations of our sources, what we can even know from them. As Michel Trouillot has pointed out in his excellent book, Silencing the Past, which is about the Haitian Revolution, he's talking about not only what is told in the past, but what has been erased. And that's something that we should think about as well when we study the past, or when you study any topic for timeline assignments or whatever it may be. Sometimes what's left out of a historical account is just as telling as what is included. We can tell what's left out if, for example, we're reading a story about independence, the independence period in Latin America, and there are no women's voices. We don't hear anything about women's participation in that. Then that should send up a red flag and say, well, wait a minute, there's something missing from this picture. I should also point out, authors don't necessarily mean to leave things out either. Sometimes we're limited by the amount of space that we have in an article or in a book or in a journal. We're limited by the kinds of questions that we ask. So if someone's asking about field artillery in independence movements, they might just totally miss that element of women's participation because they've narrowed their frame of reference, their lens, in such a way that they might just miss that sort of thing. But the point I'm driving at here is that we've kind of moved past that notion of objectivity, and we've realized that there are multiple historical truths that we can arrive at as we study the past, as long as we try to understand it from as many perspectives as possible. Since we know that the way history is told depends on a person's place in their own society, what I'm talking about here is power relations. That includes things like race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on. When we think about historical significance, we're thinking really about how things relate to each other and how we explain why things matter in the past. There are always a number of ways to do so. Because there are so many different perspectives and ways of looking at the past, there's not one single way to explain something's historical significance. And on the title down below, I have So What, Who Cares? And that's what this GIF is all about. The So What, Who Cares element. This is something that an editor at a press mentioned to a group of us as we were preparing an anthology that will be published in the next couple of years. I have an essay in that anthology And he said, when you're revising these essays for this specific book, be very specific about addressing that question of so what, who cares? Why does this matter? And so it's not just telling a story just to tell a story, but explaining this is what the story means, providing some analysis and interpretation. For our assignments then in this class, that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about historical significance. I'm saying provide some analysis and interpretation to tell us why this is important or why this person's important. So as one example here for the timeline assignment, and this is a very simplified example. I didn't write out a very lengthy biographical description of Juana Azurduy, just because I didn't want to take up too much space. And you'll see I'm going to have some other items pop in here in just a second. So if I wanted to post about Juana Azurduy on the timeline, I would enter a description of her, something like this one. I would include, of course, an image and the outside sources that I used, or just one source can be embedded in the timeline. And then once I was done writing this thing, I should ask myself, did I answer that question of so what, and who cares? I've mostly just told the narrative here, or it's not even much of a narrative, it's just kind of a description of who she was, a couple things about her. We know that she commanded troops during the independence age in what is now Bolivia, but we don't really know much else. We don't really know why that matters. So when you need to take the next step then and add something about historical significance, you should ask yourself this question as well. You'd say, well, I didn't get to that question of so what, who cares yet? And also, how is the best way to do that? How can I best explain her historical significance in this situation? Here are a couple examples. Here's one possibility. I'm not going to read it out loud to you because you can read. You can pause this if you want to read it. But this one goes at significance from the angle of what her role as a military leader says about the place of women in the late Spanish colonial period. I don't do as much about necessarily the independence age, but saying because she came from a privileged position and because of the way that Spanish laws were, she had relative freedoms that women in other European empires would not have had. That doesn't mean that she could just do as she pleased. Of course, her military service was something that she was able to get at because of her husband's position in the military, because of their wealth. But again, it's explaining her life tells us something about the bigger picture. This is why it matters. That's why it's significant. You'll also notice I didn't use the words historical significance here. You don't necessarily have to. You don't have to beat your reader over the head with that and say this is significant because. You can go that way, but you don't have to. And as I said, there are a number of ways always to explain historical significance. So here's another one. Rather than talking about gender roles and power relations, this one is thinking about what she accomplished in taking the mining city of Potosi, mining town probably of Potosi. So this is explaining Potosi's significance in terms of its place in the colonial empire, and also its significance in terms of the independence forces being able to take control of it from Spain. So she did that. She was the one that facilitated that, hence her efforts were very important in terms of the overall independence movement. So hopefully that's helpful in thinking about historical significance and what we're getting at with the timeline assignments. What this class is all about and what history is all about is thinking critically about sources, about what we can know of the past, and asking new questions. As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead, it's not even past. It actually was one of his characters, it wasn't even him. But the point is important. It's that we keep reinterpreting the past in the present in order to give it significance. That means that history is somewhat of a subjective pursuit. That doesn't mean there isn't truth in it. That doesn't mean that we can't look for evidence and facts. We should do all of those things. There are histories that are downright untrue. So we need to try to represent the past in its fullness as much as possible. And as Kevin Gannon said, who is the tattoo professor, I gave you this reading in Unit 1, significance is not inherent, it is bestowed. So again, there's not just something about about a particular historical figure or event that makes it significant. That's not readily apparent. Instead, the author has to explain what that reason is. And that's what we're doing here. We're providing that analysis for our readers. Lastly, I wanted to point out that just because something is the first, or just because something is still in existence, those things don't necessarily equal significance. So that's what we're talking about. Those things don't make something inherently significant. Instead, you need to explain why it matters that the thing that you're talking about was the first or is still in existence. And I mention that just because many times when people approach this assignment, those are examples they give for significance. That can be part of it, and that can be on the road to significance. But that's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily make something important just because of those things. Thanks for watching this. I hope it helps with our thoughts about historical significance and analyzing the past.